Testing witness mic for Dr. West. Witness mic for Dr. West.
Just make sure you push the button.
To talk.
Yeah, you see it picks up, you can hear it picks up pretty well,
Really?
so.
Good morning. A quorum being present, the Committee on Education and the Workforce will come to order. Welcome to today's hearing. I want to thank our panel of witnesses and our members for being here today as we talk about charter schools and the invaluable role these institutions play in the lives of millions of students. All students, regardless of zip code, deserve access to a high-quality education. That means giving students the opportunity to thrive in the learning environment that best suits their unique educational needs. Every student is different, and families should be empowered to choose whatever school best suits their child's strengths, rather than being forced into a one-size-fits-all approach. For many, charter schools are the best option for their students to hone his or her individual abilities and build a successful life. Though they're still relatively new on the scene, with the first having opened just over 25 years ago, charter schools have proven an immensely popular option. These institutions currently serve over 3 million students nationwide, while surveys show another 5 million students would enroll in a charter school if given the chance. In an effort to meet this growing demand, the Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA, maintained and improved the important charter school program. The new law included reforms not only to support the development of high-quality new schools, but also to allow for the expansion and replication of high-quality charter schools already found around the country. The reforms include requirements to help these schools improve recruitment and retention of students, as well as to support better authorizing practices and reforms to help charter schools access facilities financing. Charter schools also face rigorous accountability. These schools not only have to comply with the same accountability requirements as all other public schools, including the accountability requirements under ESSA, but they also face a rigorous approval process just to open their doors and have to meet the expectations of the parents sending their children to the school. Too often, students in underserved areas suffer from a lack of access to educational opportunities and by default remain trapped in the failing status quo. When there is a community need for high-quality primary and secondary education, and the traditional public schools in the area are struggling to produce strong student outcomes, charter schools can offer students a lifeline. In fact, charter schools can be the difference between a student dropping out of high school and going on to pursue post-secondary education. Data reported by the 74 million shows that charter school students from high-performing charter school networks graduate from college at 3 to 5 times the national average for children from low-income families. I've had the immense privilege of hearing from countless charter school students and their parents, and they consistently tell me the same thing. Their local charter school provided them with new hope and opportunity when the traditional public schools in their area failed to pass muster. Over the weekend, I saw that positive impact firsthand. I had the honor of speaking at the commencement ceremony for Millennium Charter Academy in my district, a school I've seen grow from the ground up into a thriving, exciting, and inspiring place. It's because of schools like Millennium Charter that more students in my district have a shot at building a prosperous life. Today's hearing presents an opportunity to examine the myriad ways charter schools are changing lives. It also presents an opportunity to recommit to what matters most, giving more students the opportunity to receive an excellent education that inspires a lifelong love of learning. With that, I recognize Ranking Member Scott for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The title of today's hearing suggests that the power of charter schools is nothing but positive. Majority's witnesses, with limited exception, will describe a sector of schools that is fixing our nation's allegedly dismal system of public education, saving the children, and satisfying all parents. We'll hear calls for increased federal charter school funding and rapidly expanded charter schools in every community across the country. But such glorified telling is only part of the study. It is our job as policymakers to examine the full impact of charter schools, both good and bad, on the children and families they serve. As is usually the case, the truth about charter schools is complicated. There are some good, even great things happening in the public charter schools. There are some areas of serious and legitimate concern. A large-scale study of student data from 16 states conducted by the Center for Research on Education Outcomes at Stanford University found that only 17% of charter schools produce academic gains that were significantly better than traditional public schools, 17%. 37% of charter schools performed worse than their traditional public school counterparts serving similar students. 46%, there was virtually no difference. I used to say that on average, charter schools are average. This recent research is showing that on average, charter schools are below average. Public school education is a bedrock of our democracy, as noted by our founding fathers and numerous Supreme Court justices. The provision of free developmental education to all children serves a compelling community interest. When public school choice helps fully realize the promise of a public school system that delivers quality for every student in every public school, it has my full support. But places like Denver and Massachusetts have successfully used strong oversight to build a cohesive system focused on delivering quality across the board. But if Denver and Massachusetts are the bright spots, Michigan, and Detroit in particular, is a stain on the record of public school choice. In the early 2000s, Michigan reliably ranked above the national average on the National Assessment of Educational Progress. However, by 2015, only 7 states scored lower than Michigan in 4th grade reading, and no state scored lower for black students in reading or math. Detroit students scored below those in every other major American city. Now, thanks in part to political advocacy and financial support from our current Secretary of Education and her family, Michigan has become a cautionary tale of free market ideology applied to public education. The state legislature first enacted and then took steps to repeatedly weaken state oversight and charter authorization standards. In doing so, it invited a surge of unchecked charter expansion without planning or purpose. Michigan is now what many refer to as the Wild West of charter school reforms. In Detroit, 12 different authorities have opened and closed schools without coordination or uniform standards of accountability. A recent study from Michigan State University found that the financial strain on school districts, including Detroit, was overwhelmingly caused by declining enrollment and revenue loss, especially where school choice and charters were most prevalent. This research shows that as the state relaxed charter accountability, schools and cities statewide lost nearly half of their revenue in a span of just 10 years. Unlike states that use public school choice to improve quality across the board, Michigan used charter schools to undermine and dismantle the public system. The state diverted public dollars to low-quality, for-profit charters, saturated the marketplace, and then used the declining enrollment as a justification to close other non-charter public schools. Nowhere is this truer than Detroit, where there have been more than 160 school openings and closure since just 2010. As a result, students and parents are suffering in a chaotic, inequitable, and underfunded public system that is devoid of quality and rife with for-profit actors overpromising and under-delivering. Academic outcomes have gotten worse, not better. Nearly 80% of the charter schools are for-profit, with 8 in 10 charters posting achievement below the statewide average. And while the state took modest steps in 2016 to right some of these wrongs, more must be done. And I look forward to hearing the perspective of Jonathan Clark, a Detroit parent, on the impact of irresponsible policy choices. In 2010, the year before Michigan lifted its charter cap, the state won a $7 million grant from the Federal Charter School Program, the CSP. And it's the committee's responsibility to have honest dialogue about our role in protecting students and taxpayers from gross abuses before we increase funding and promote the expansion of public school choice at the expense of increasing federal investment in core programs like Title I. In response to the ongoing operational challenges in the charter school program, the CSP, I fought to make improvements in the program. Of particular concern was a significant risk to taxpayers posed by continued federal investment in states like Michigan with extremely weak charter school laws that allowed unaccountable, low-quality schools to flourish. The Every Student Succeeds Act included a stronger provision focusing on quality, authorizing equity for families and students. These changes were long overdue. However, CSP is a limited policy lever to improve charter quality nationwide. While states opting to participate in the program need to improve practices before accessing funds, the policy approach fails to ensure quality across the states. While ESSA's improvements to CSP are necessary and an important step, I remain concerned with the commitment and honoring the spirit and intent of the law by the present leadership in the Department of Education. Given the Secretary's advocacy in Michigan, there are serious and justifiable concerns under the present leadership. The Department will not hold CSP grantees accountable for fulfilling new program requirements, and I'm concerned that the Secretary will not prioritize funding for high-quality charters that seek to improve student diversity in their replication and expansion efforts, a priority I fought to include in ESSA. This will not be the first time that the Department has ignored equity guardrails in the law. In 2016, I released the findings from a GAO study on racial and socioeconomic isolation in public schools. The GAO found that on the whole, public education was resegregating and that rapid growth of socioeconomic and racial isolation in charter schools was a contributing factor. The number of highly segregated schools more than doubled between 2001 and 2014, from 7,000 schools to 15,000 schools. During that time, there was a decrease in the prevalence of while there was a decrease in the prevalence of segregated non-charter public schools, the share of segregated public schools that are charter schools increased from 3% to 13%. In 2001, there were just 210 segregated charter schools nationwide. By 2014, there were nearly 2,000. The role of choice in education and educational segregation is hotly debated, but facts are facts. We now have more choice options than ever before, and a public system is more segregated now than any time since 1970. In a system where fewer children are bound by neighborhood schools, in communities segregated due to decades of discriminatory zoning and housing policy, segregation should be decreasing. Instead, it's on the rise. Studies have shown that choice policies around the world in those studies, we've had warnings that choice must come with checks and balances to prevent adverse impact on inequality and segregation. In a 2017 publication, Andreas Schleicher was quoted as saying, "The risk that school choice and voucher systems result in higher levels of social segregation among schools, less social and cultural heterogeneity among schools, and less access to high-quality education for children from disadvantaged backgrounds is real, but this risk can be mitigated by the way the systems are designed." Now, choice devoid of protections to improve diversity will exacerbate segregation, and separate, whether charter or non-charter, is inherently unequal. In closing, I again refer to the words of Mr. Schleicher, who said that the more flexibility there is in a school system, the stronger the policy needs to be. In other words, public school choice with public oversight and strong accountability can improve our system as a whole. Choice devoid of strong policy will not. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Pursuant to Committee Rule 7C, all members will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the permanent hearing record. Without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 14 days to allow such statements and other extraneous material referenced during the hearing to be submitted for the official hearing record. I will now introduce our distinguished witnesses. Mrs. Nina Reese is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. Mr. Greg Richmond is the President and CEO of the National Association of Charter School Authorizers, NACSA. Mr. Jonathan Clark is a parent and community activist in Detroit. Dr. Martin West is an Associate Professor of Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I now ask our witnesses to raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record reflect our witnesses answered in the affirmative. Before I recognize you to provide your testimony, let me briefly remind you of our lighting system. We allow 5 minutes for a witness to present testimony. When you begin, the light in front of you will turn green. When 1 minute is left, the light will turn yellow. At the 5-minute mark, your light will turn red. At that point, I ask that you wrap up your testimony. Members will each have 5 minutes to ask questions of the witnesses. Mrs. Reese, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Great. Chairwoman Fox, Ranking Member Scott, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to discuss how charter schools are promoting opportunity in America's schools. My name is Nina Reese, and I'm the President and CEO of the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. The name of our organization reflects a fundamental fact about charter schools. Charter schools are public schools. They are open to all students. They are open to all students with no admission requirements and no tuition. They are diverse in every sense, serving children from every background and ability level, located in cities, suburbs, and rural areas, offering a variety of school models that make education dynamic for students who learn in different ways. One of the most uplifting aspects of my job is visiting charter schools around the country. A few weeks ago, I visited Dream Charter School in Representative Espaillat's district in Harlem. The school was organized by community leaders who saw that the children in their neighborhood needed access to healthy activities. It began as an athletic program on 2 baseball diamonds. It grew into an after-school program and a summer enrichment program. And finally, realizing that they could have their biggest impact during the school day, the founders started a charter school. Today, Dream Charter School serves about 650 students. 27% of these students have special needs, higher than the citywide average of 21%. And Dream students outperform city peers and district peers on both English language arts and math exams. Dream is just one of 7,000 public charter schools serving 3.2 million students across 43 states. Charter schools now educate 6% of the K-12 students nationally, with much higher percentages in some communities. They're more likely than other public schools to enroll students of color, as well as students from low-income backgrounds. Where charter schools are available, students no longer have their academic options limited by their zip code. A growing number of charter schools are making diversity an essential component of their design alongside academic excellence. And leaders in cities such as Denver, San Antonio, and Indianapolis have pursued collaboration between district and charter schools in order to make high-quality public school options accessible to as many students as possible. Charter schools thrive where they have the freedom to innovate, to pursue diverse ways of teaching, and to respond to the needs of students rather than the mandates of bureaucracies. And charter schools perform best when they're held to high standards. Accountability is a central value of charter schools. We know that for public school choice to be truly meaningful, public school choices must be of high quality. In addition to being held accountable to policymakers and authorizers, charter schools are also held accountable to parents and caregivers who want what's best for their children. The growth of the charter school movement has been made possible by these parents and by the consistent bipartisan support from policymakers. Presidents Clinton, Bush, Obama, and Trump have all supported charter schools. And Democrats and Republicans in the House have expanded access to charter schools through the Charter Schools program. We're grateful to Chairwoman Fox, Ranking Member Scott, and the members of this committee for the role that you played in modernizing this program when you reauthorized the Every Student Succeeds Act. We're also a long way, unfortunately, from meeting the parental demand for charter schools. Recent surveys indicate that an estimated 5 million additional students would go to a charter school if one was available in their neighborhood. The need for more charter schools is particularly acute in rural areas and on tribal lands. But even in our largest cities, where charter schools have their largest presence, there are still too many students on wait lists and neighborhoods that have no access to charter schools. The limited availability of high cost of facilities is one of the impediments to the growth of charter schools. Charter schools often don't have access to the funding sources that support facilities needs of district schools. Charter schools often must meet their facilities needs using funds that they would otherwise support their academic programs. It's a situation that requires immediate and urgent assistance. Recent funding increases in Congress will help support the creation of hundreds of additional charter schools serving thousands of students and provide sorely needed assistance to improve charter school facilities. The charter school community is grateful for this funding and looks forward to the federal government continuing to strengthen its commitment to charter school students. We appreciate the committee's support for public school options, and we urge you to do all that you can to make sure that charter schools are accessible to as many more students who want or need them. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Richmond, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairwoman Fox, Ranking Member Scott, and members of the committee. Thank you for this opportunity to speak with you this morning about charter schools. My name is Greg Richmond, and I am the president of the National Association of Charter School Authorizers. We are all here today for the same reason. Too many children in America do not have an opportunity to attend a good school that prepares them for success in life. Charter schools are one way, but not the only way, to give more kids access to a good school. For if we truly want all children in America to get a good education, then we need a system of education that is diverse and contains many paths. Charter schools are an important part of that diverse system, now serving 3 million students and growing. More importantly, students who have traditionally been underserved are now benefiting. Studies show that African American, Hispanic, low-income, and special education students at charter schools all show positive gains in math and reading compared to their peers in traditional schools. The charter school idea is based on 3 pillars: access, autonomy, and accountability. When all 3 pillars are present and healthy, charter schools excel and more students get a great education. The entities that authorize charter schools play an important role balancing each of these 3 pillars. In most states, school districts authorize charter schools. But in some states, universities, state education agencies, state charter school boards, and others do this work, or some combination of all the above. Whatever the type of institution, an authorizer's job is to approve, monitor, and renew charter schools. Because they are public schools, authorizers in states hold charter schools accountable in many ways. Some of these ways are the same as traditional public schools, while others go above and beyond. For example, charter schools administer the same standardized tests as all other public schools. They must comply with all federal laws on special education and non-discrimination. They must conduct annual audits of their finances. In most states, they are subject to the same public information and transparency laws as any other public body. They can lose their charter if they perform poorly. And perhaps the most important form of accountability, a charter school can only exist if parents choose to send their children to it. Some of you may be thinking right now that you have heard of a charter school that has not complied with everything on this list, and this is certainly true. While most charter schools are doing a good job for kids and playing by the rules, some are not. Good authorizers monitor the performance and actions of their schools and step in if something is wrong. However, this is not always happening. Where we have significant problems with charter school accountability, the root of the problem is often poor authorizing. Good authorizing is also essential for the other 2 pillars of chartering, access and autonomy. As public schools, charter schools should be accessible to all students. This means they must have fair and transparent applications and lotteries. No student should be inappropriately expelled or counseled out of a school. Charter schools open doors of opportunity to all students, especially those that do not currently have access to a good school. And a good authorizer helps expand access for all students by creating equitable systems and providing families with information to make choices. A good authorizer also ensures that each school has the autonomy and flexibility it needs to be innovative and excellent. We don't want a one-size-fits-all standardized education system. Children are unique, and we need a variety of types of schools to meet their unique needs. So good authorizing makes sure there is a good balance of these three pillars: access, autonomy, and accountability. The problem is that we don't have good authorizing everywhere. We have a Goldilocks situation. Some authorizers are doing too much, some are doing too little, and some are getting it just right. Where we have significant problems with charter schools, the root of the problem is often poor authorizing. There is a role for the federal government in improving charter school authorizing, but it is a limited role. Federal laws already provide appropriate parameters for special education and non-discrimination. And in addition, the bipartisan reforms within the charter school program included in ESSA already reward and encourage states to improve charter school quality. After that, there is no one-size-fits-all solution for charter school authorizing in every state. Every state has a unique charter school law, history, and experience, and it is up to each state to take appropriate actions. Collectively, each of these bodies must uphold their assigned roles to make the charter school model or any school model work. In many places and with many charter schools, all of this is actually working pretty well right now. Just ask the millions of parents and families who are choosing a charter school for their child. But there are real issues, questions, and opportunities involving charter schools with real consequences for children. So I'm delighted we're having this conversation. Too many children in America do not have the opportunity to attend a good school. And when done well, authorizing can be a catalyst for charter schools that helps more children get that opportunity. That's why we're working to strengthen authorizing across the country, and that is why I thank you for supporting this work.
Thank you, Mr. Richmond. Mr. Clark, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Representatives Fox and Scott and members of the committee. My name is Jonathan Phillip Clark. I'm the father of 7 wonderful children and an Iraq War veteran. I work at Mission City, a nonprofit that provides mentoring, tutoring, and an arts camp during the summer. I live with my wife and 4 of our children. I also serve on the board of directors for 482 Forward, a group of parents and students that advocate for a high-quality, equitable education for Detroit children. Of my 7 children, 3 currently attend school in Detroit. We have had children in public, charter, and private schools, and we have had good and bad experiences in all 3. But there are a few experiences in charter schools that I want to bring to your attention. My oldest daughter attended University Yes Academy Charter School for 4 years. The students attended school from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. with 2 hours of math and 2 hours of English each day, and a weekly college seminar class to help them prepare for college. The school also promised dual enrollment to the students. For the first 3 years, the school kept its promises. Then, during Dana's 10th grade year, the 2 hours each of math and English were reduced to 45 minutes per day. The college seminar class was reduced to a once-a-month meeting after school, and only some students were invited to attend. When we asked about the dual enrollment program, we were told that our daughter, who had maintained a 4.0 since kindergarten, was not eligible because she had not scored high enough on her practice ACT test. UIA had 5 principals in 3 years. An audit revealed that the school could not account for $300,000 of Title I funds. The board canceled the contract with the management company, then signed a contract with a new management company headed by the exact same person. A second new management company decided to close the school a week before school started. When parents, teachers, and students pressed for answers, we were ignored by the board. You may think that UIA was a unique situation, but around the same time, my other 2 daughters attended 2 other charters with similar problems. The management company that ran both of those schools left in the middle of the school year, firing the principals and some teachers without notifying the parents. Friends of mine are struggling today at a school that has had 5 principals and 2 management companies in 5 years. Others will point out that we had a choice. We could stay or we could leave. The system of choice is premised on the belief that the threat of us leaving will incentivize schools to get better. But parents don't want to leave. If you've ever had to figure out a transportation schedule for 4 kids at 4 different schools, you'll understand what I'm saying. If you've ever had to watch your child struggle to find new friends yet again, you'll understand what I'm saying. If you've ever gotten a different job just so you could accommodate your kids' schedules, you'll understand what I'm saying. When parents tried to voice our frustrations and ask for stability in the management of the school and for the school to deliver what it had promised, we learned that there wasn't an elected board we could vote out. The charter authorizer we were supposed to go to was 350 miles away from the city of Detroit. This system allows the people who are in charge, the authorizers, and, to a lesser extent, the board members, to have no personal relationship to the consequences of their decisions. These schools are not in their neighborhoods. Their children do not attend these schools. The children of their friends and neighbors do not attend these schools. Michigan's charter system has allowed schools to promise things and not deliver them, and to continue to take taxpayer money without providing Michigan's and, in particular, Detroit students a quality education. I encourage you as members of this committee to remain vigilant in holding Education Secretary DeVos and this administration accountable for the charter reforms that ESSA enacted. Her influence over the charter sector is no longer confined to Michigan. Based on my experience, I would not wish Michigan charters policies on the nation. The word choice sounds good, but the system of choice that we live in requires my wife and I to drive around our city for hours to get our children to and from their schools. It requires us to attend countless open houses and be wooed by promises of after-school programs, dual enrollment, advanced math and reading, and state-of-the-art technology, but with no mechanism to ensure that we're given what we have been promised. This is my children's lives and their education. They don't get to do it again. Even more than choice, they deserve a quality education, and parents deserve a voice in that education. Thank you.
Dr. West, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairwoman Fox, Ranking Member Scott, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. My name is Marty West. I'm an associate professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and also a member of the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, our state's sole charter school authorizer. Today's hearing is timely in light of April's release of the 2017 National Assessment of Educational Progress, often called the nation's report card. The latest results showed a slight uptick in 8th grade reading scores, but were otherwise flat, continuing a period of stagnation that's persisted for a decade. This lack of progress has led some to question the model of school reform our nation has pursued in recent years. These questions are appropriate, but they should not lead us to ignore evidence on one reform that has worked: the creation of charter schools to provide new public school options for millions of families, particularly those living in low-performing urban school districts. The emergence of charter schools has been a state-led reform, but the federal government has provided the charter sector with critical support through startup funds, facilities financing, and since 2010, grants to replicate or expand charter schools with a strong track record. This is an attractive model of federal education policy, supporting promising state policies and encouraging, not mandating, that other states consider them. In my view, the accumulated research on charter schools also speaks to the value of and continued need for these federal investments. It confirms that charter schools are providing high-quality options for millions of students in need of alternatives to their local district, that they're doing so in a cost-effective way, and that the performance of the charter sector as a whole is improving over time, in stark contrast to the stagnation seen among public schools as a whole. It's often said that the evidence on charter schools is mixed. Individual charter schools do vary widely in their effectiveness, as Mr. Clark's testimony powerfully illustrates. And the most comprehensive studies of the charter sector suggest little difference on average in how much students learn in charter and nearby district schools. Yet dismissing the charter sector's track record as mixed ignores clear evidence of benefits for students from low-income families, students of color, and students living in urban areas, all groups for whom educational opportunities are too often limited. Studies from my home state of Massachusetts illustrate this pattern of results. In our urban centers, each year of attendance at an oversubscribed charter middle school increases students' achievement by 15% of a standard deviation in reading and 32% in math. These effects are among the largest on record for an educational intervention implemented at scale, large enough to close the black-white achievement gap in 3 years. In contrast, attending a charter school in a suburban or rural area lowers students' achievement by a small amount, despite the fact that these schools are popular enough to hold admissions lotteries. Many of these non-urban charter schools have a distinctive curricular emphasis that may explain their sustained popularity despite a lack of success in improving test scores. Even so, this pattern strongly suggests that the availability of charter schools has improved the equity of student outcomes in our state. The strong performance of urban charter schools nationwide is particularly impressive given that in many states, charters continue to receive substantially less funding than their district peers, as much as 28% less, according to a 2014 study. This funding gap implies that charter schools provide a far greater return on investment for spending on public education. There's also evidence that the performance of the charter sector is improving over time for multiple reasons. First, many charter schools are new, and schools tend to become more effective as they mature. Second, a growing share of the charter sector comprises schools that are part of nonprofit charter management organizations, which tend to be more effective than standalone schools. Most importantly, research from multiple states confirms that low-performing charter schools are more likely to close, either due to a lack of parental demand or as a result of authorizer decisions. This provides a mechanism for continuous improvement that's generally not present in the traditional public sector. It's worth emphasizing that the additional high-quality options created by the charter sector have not come at the expense of students who remain enrolled in traditional districts. Rather, the bulk of the evidence suggests that the presence of charter schools has a modest positive effect on students in nearby district schools. And there are a growing number of examples of charter schools partnering with districts to share best practices. It's therefore disappointing that after a decade of climbing by 6 to 9% a year, growth in the number of charter schools nationally has fallen to 2% annually over the past 3 years. This is not due to a lack of demand. It's not due to a lack of need. One factor is surely the gap in the state and local funding charters receive and the difficulties many charter entrepreneurs face in securing adequate school facilities. This makes continued federal support for and investment in the charter sector all the more vital. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Again, I want to thank the witnesses for being here today and for sharing your testimony with us. I'll now recognize members for 5 minutes. Mr. Guthrie, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and appreciate you guys being here today. I'm from Kentucky, and I just finished I think I have 21 counties, I do have 21 counties, and finished my 20th town hall in the last couple of months. And because of what's going on in the General Assembly, a lot of people came and were interested in charter schools. And I know, and my answer to them was basically that's decided in Frankfurt, not necessarily in Washington. But so I know that we're looking at this and how we can assist and help move forward. A lot of it, Kentucky passed a charter school law, I think last year, if I remember correctly, and so there's kind of still some unknowns of the process. So I kind of thought, for my edification, hopefully anybody watching or listening, Mr. Richmond, if you would, I know that you're the Association of Authorizers. But what happens? The state passes a charter school law. Of course, every state's different, I guess. Ours is public charter schools. Kind of what's the process that I could help explain to some of my constituents when I'm home? So what the kind of process here, or now it's been authorized, the governor signs it, and boom, what takes place next?
Sure.
And if you know Kentucky's situation, that would be a good, I know they're all different, yeah.
I know I have some familiarity with Kentucky, certainly not complete familiarity. So just, as you said, in Kentucky, they're public charter schools, and just to be clear, they are everywhere in the country. In every state, charter schools are public schools. The process in Kentucky ended up with a law that limited charter schools to just a few communities. I think it was Louisville and Lexington.
Lexington, I believe, yeah.
Are the only two cities where charter schools are permitted in Kentucky, if I'm recalling correctly. In those two cities, folks who want to start a charter school, which could be educators, community organizations, they have to put together a proposal. What's their idea? What's their educational plan? What grade levels do they want to serve? Where is it going to be located? They have to answer a lot of questions and get approved by the authorizers in Kentucky to operate. That is, those conversations are just beginning right now in Kentucky. And if there is something that happens in terms of the establishment of a charter school in Kentucky, it's not going to be this fall, maybe the year after or the year after that.
So is there something from the federal level that we get in the way, or we can improve, or we can help the process, or is it completely something that happens in Frankfurt, Indianapolis, Nashville?
It is mostly driven by what's happening in Frankfurt or in Louisville. There are folks in Kentucky working on getting this up and going. The Pritchard Committee is one group, and others. The federal charter school program is a competitive grant program that would allow folks in Kentucky to apply for some funds to help get that going. So they can apply in the next cycle for some of those funds to help get this started.
Okay. And Ms. Reese, I think you, in your testimony, I had to step to another, I had to vote in another committee. And Dr. West, you mentioned at the very end about the facility situation. I know, in Kentucky law. So could you, Dr. Reese, I'll ask you, and if you want to talk to Dr. West, could you explain the importance of providing charter schools assistance for facilities, and why don't they have access to buildings like traditional public schools do? I guess that's up to each state. That's kind of hard to ask a question because it depends on what's going on in the state.
So very quickly, charter schools by and large don't have access to the same funding streams that are available to the traditional systems, such as municipal bonds and local tax credits. The way to mitigate that is by having having the state enact a law that would attach per pupil facilities funding to follow children to charter schools, because the average per pupil allocation doesn't include facilities finance. At the federal level, there are several programs that are helping with this. The Credit Enhancement Program, which is part of the charter schools program, is one of them. To the extent there's a discussion about infrastructure at the national level, at the federal level, that's the other place where we could certainly highlight the discrepancy between what charters get and what the traditional system gets. But ultimately, this is a state and local issue, and we think it should be dealt with at the state level primarily. I will also just say, in Kentucky, we played a role in enacting the law in Kentucky. We're very proud of it. It's currently ranked in the top 10 of the highest quality laws in the nation, so we're very much looking forward to seeing that law implemented. Currently, districts in Kentucky can all authorize charter schools, but our experience has been that districts tend not to authorize a lot of charter schools. So we're grateful that we have 2 cities that are now able to do that. But the first thing that needs to happen in Kentucky is the passage of the funding stream. If there's no funding, you can't open a school. That
was a debate in the last General Assembly. Dr. West, I only have 10 seconds, so.
Very briefly on facilities, it's a key barrier for schools getting off the ground. There are many different ways to solve that challenge. One option is to provide charter schools direct access to capital facilities, capital funding rather. Another, though, is to require that districts make space available to charter schools that are located within them. Different states have taken different approaches to try to address this challenge. One of the nice things about the changes in the Every Student Succeeds Act to the charter schools program is that it asks states, so if Kentucky wanted to apply for those funds, it would have to say how it is addressing facilities access for charter schools. It would not dictate exactly how Kentucky needs to do that.
I think my time's expired now. Y'all back. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Courtney, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. In particular, Mr. Clark, thank you for your military service, which again, we can never underscore that enough. During your testimony, Mr. Clark, again, you described your pretty concrete, real-life terms, the impact of a very obviously unstable situation in the Detroit school systems. The flip side of the rapid expansion of charters in Detroit was also, coincided with closing of a lot of the traditional public schools in a lot of neighborhoods in Detroit. And can you just sort of kind of describe to us what your thoughts are and your experience in terms of what's been the impact in terms of other kids and families in your neighborhoods.
Okay, so, thank you. So, in my neighborhood, Brightmoor, we call it an education desert, okay? Over the past, I would say 10 years, the majority of our schools have either closed down or been taken over by charters. Once the charters leave, for whatever reason, the building is left there. Now, for our neighborhood, for our part of town, that's a serious safety issue. An abandoned building is a haven for crime and blight. Children when a child wakes up in the morning and he does not have a place to go, like school, that's traumatic. And when you have parents that cannot get them to a school for lack of transportation and resources, that adds to the problem. As schools pop up and go away, there's only one victim, and that's the people in that neighborhood. When the school shuts down, they don't repurpose the building. They just pack up their things and they just leave it. Then you have kids that run through, people go in there and they steal the piping, they deface the outside, and it just brings down the entire neighborhood.
Again, thank you for, pretty vividly, painting that picture for us. Secretary DeVos's budget for 2019 actually proposes increasing funding for charters by roughly about 80%. It's almost a doubling of the number that was funded in 2018. I mean, what's your thought about whether Congress should, embrace that large an increase? Again, given the fact that there is a mixed story here in terms of charter effectiveness.
My experience with charter schools as a whole, as I said in my testimony, I'm not very hopeful. Giving more money to build more charter schools, to me, in my personal opinion, is not going to help my situation in Detroit. A lot of these charter schools are not in the neighborhoods where they're needed. And if they are, they're no better than the public school. Broken promises, they hurt. Not just the student, but it hurts the parents as well. It is very discouraging to know that you send your kid to a place where they're not getting the best quality education possible. It's very discouraging when an administration, school administration, says, I'm going to give your child A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, and I don't get it. Not only do I not get it, who's going to hold them accountable for not giving me what they promised?
Great. Thank you. Dr. West, the ranking member cited some information from GAO about the fact that schools are actually sort of resegregating, or the segregation is intensifying. In your opinion, as an expert in education, does that matter?
I do believe it matters, both because we know that racial isolation can have an impact on student outcomes, and because I think we all would like to live in a society where our schools are, to the extent possible, representative of the communities that they serve. It is the case that charters.
Thank you. Again, I've only got 6 seconds left, and I just want to, again, ask the chair. I want to have submitted to the record a report from Brookings Institute, how charter schools are prolonging segregation. Just ask that it be
Without
admitted to the record
objection.
and yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. Mr. Banks, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. My home state of Indiana is a great example of the ability of charter schools to create opportunity and lift academic achievement. As Mrs. Reese is well aware, the National Association of Public Charter Schools has ranked Indiana's charter school law as the best in the country for 3 years in a row. And as Mr. Richmond is well aware, the National Association of Charter School Authorizers has consistently ranked Indiana's charter school policies as among the best in the nation. This is clear from the data. The 2013 National Credo Study found that students in Indiana charter schools gained 36 days of learning and reading per year and 14 days of learning in math, both above the national average. I was proud to be involved in the effort to expand access to charter schools during my time as a state senator by sponsoring the bill that created the Indiana Charter School Board and allowed private universities to authorize new charter schools. I believe the success of Indiana charter schools can be attributed to the ability of multiple authorizers to start charter schools that maintain the autonomy to innovate. At the same time, these schools are being held to the highest academic standards and, unlike traditional public schools, face the threat of closure if they do not meet these standards. So, Mrs. Reese and Mr. Richmond, would you both agree that Indiana's model of freedom, accountability, and multiple sources of authorization is a good model for other states? Mrs. Reese?
Absolutely. We ranked Indiana first on our model law ranking report for that very reason. It walks the balance between autonomy, accountability, and outcomes in a very robust way. And what's also really interesting about Indiana is the work that's happening in Indianapolis, which started when Mayor Bart Peterson, who's a Democrat, was the mayor and has continued over time. There is a sense of collaboration between the district and the charter school system. The community views charter schools as part of the fabric of public education, and we firmly believe that that model is one that should be replicated in more cities, and certainly places like DC and San Antonio and Denver have emulated that, and we hope that other school district officials come to Indianapolis and emulate those best practices.
Anything to add, Mr. Richmond?
Two things. One, just to echo a reference you made around the role of the mayor of Indianapolis. It has been critical in having that kind of collaboration and communication across all schools, and we sometimes see that missing, too often see it missing in other cities. So this works really well when you have someone like a mayor providing that kind of leadership across all schools. We do rank Indiana's charter school law very high in our system. One of the reasons for that is the accountability that they have for the authorizing bodies. You mentioned that there are multiple authorizers in Indiana. And as part of that, an Indiana authorizer can actually lose its power to continue authorizing schools if it approves and lets bad schools stay open. We support that. We believe in accountability for all of our actions, and that's one of the aspects of Indiana's law that makes it successful. Everyone is accountable for good outcomes for kids.
So with that, Mr. Richmond, how important is it for the federal government to maintain the flexibility of federal funding for charters and to allow multiple types of authorizers to be able to access those funds?
We think one of the strengths of the charter school movement is that flexibility, that it is not standardized across the whole country. You see different states trying different things. Some are working better than others. So we think it's important for the federal role in charter schools to continue to support that flexibility while having some incentives, like it does have in ESSA, in the Federal Charter School Program. There are incentives for states to tackle issues around quality. So the incentives are in there, but then each state gets to build its own solutions, and we think that's the right way to go.
Dr. West, anything to add on that flexibility?
No, I just very much agree with Mr. Richmond that the best approach is likely to vary from state to state, and the charter schools program encourages attention to these issues but doesn't dictate exactly how they need to be addressed, and I think that's a appropriate role.
Thanks to each of you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Banks. Ms. Bonamici, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fox. Thank you to the witnesses. As policymakers here, I see our obligation as one to make sure that all children have access to a high-quality education that includes great schools, great teachers, great administrators. That includes all students, particularly traditionally underserved students, students with disabilities, English language learners. They should all have that access. I see this as a moral issue, but also as a civil rights obligation. Now, I worked on this issue when I was a state legislator as well as a member of Congress, and I have to say that I'm, in general, skeptical about charter schools because they are not addressing the underlying issue of equity of opportunity for all. Mr. Clark, thank you for your testimony and raising some of those important concerns about the lack of stability of many charter schools, especially in Michigan. I wish we were having a robust discussion about how great magnet schools have been in the districts that have them, where we have a level playing field, where we have an elected school board, where the schools are not opening and closing based on the management and creating that instability. But we're here today, and so I want to focus on and talk about online charter schools, many of which are for profit. Although certainly online classes can expand educational opportunities for students, especially in rural areas, online schools typically require a learning coach, for example, often a parent, making families who don't have at least one stay-at-home parent out of the loop. They have to monitor students during the day, and in fact, in my home state of Oregon, less than half of the students who attend online charter schools graduated on time, and that's 30 points behind the state average. In 2015, the Center for Research on Education Outcomes at Stanford led a report examining the performance of online charter schools in 17 states, including Oregon. They found that online charter schools have an overwhelmingly negative effect on student achievement. On average, they lost 180 days of learning in math and 72 days of learning in reading. One researcher concluded losing 180 days of learning in math is, quote, literally as if the kid did not go to school for an entire year. Indiana has had, we were just talking about Indiana, they had Indiana Virtual School that graduated a lower percentage of students than almost every other high school in the state. I want to ask you, Mr. Clark, as a taxpayer and a parent, what do you think about these online charter schools? And what would you want to know if you were considering enrolling your student your child in an online charter school?
The first thing I would be concerned with is there a system set up to hold them accountable for the services that they say they're going to provide for my children? I'm not, and I want to say this, I'm not here to bash charter schools, but I'm here to push the fact that accountability is the key.
Absolutely,
In
and I
my
want to get
opinion.
another couple questions, and I agree, accountability is really important. That's something I worked on in the state level. Ms. Reese, I wanted to first ask you, there's something that you submitted in your testimony where you said that millions of American families are now settling for schools that are less than what they want for their children, and far too many of these students are stuck in schools so dreadful that members of this committee would not accept them as adequate for their own children or grandchildren. And your suggestion in that testimony is that if only there were a charter school, members of Congress or other involved parents would take their children and put them in a nearby charter school. As policymakers, we have to ask the question, what about those schools? How can we address the needs of all of those students who are stuck in what you are calling our schools so dreadful? Our responsibility isn't just to the students whose involved parents put them in a charter school. We have to consider all of those students. And it's the same question I asked Secretary DeVos. Why aren't we asking, why don't those schools have better teachers? Do they need better administrators? Do they need more classes? Do they have lead in the water? It's not just our responsibility to the kids who go out to another school. In your testimony, Ms. Reese, you applauded the work of charter schools, but seemed to ignore some of the problems of the for-profit and online. You probably heard about Ohio's electronic classroom of tomorrow. They abruptly closed last winter. The school was inflating student outcomes without any evidence that students were learning. An audit, they received about $19 million more from the state than they should have received, and $590 million in federal, state, and local funds, and then abruptly closed and left those students with nowhere to go. Shouldn't there be stronger oversight to make sure these schools are actually serving students rather than focusing on churning profits? And why are you encouraging removing caps and having more access to funding when so many cases like this exist? And Madam Chair, can I introduce into the record, how long will we let them fail? Indiana committee begins review of virtual charter school rules.
Without objection, the gentlewoman's time's
Oh, my time has
expired, so
expired. I'm
I'll
gonna
ask
ask
the
for
witnesses
response on the
to
record.
answer in writing
Thank you.
to Ms. Bonamici.
It's a very question. First of all, to your first point, oh,
We'll ask
Time is
you
expired.
to submit your
Oh, I see.
answers in writing. Thank you. Sorry. Mr. Allen, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mrs. Reese, would you answer that question? Because I'd like to know the answer.
well, to your first point, Congresswoman, for us, it's not an either-or. We believe that we should make investments in our public schools and make sure that they are serving the needs of the students who are in those schools. But at the same time, we also believe that families should have options. If the school is not working for them, they should be able to send their children to other schools. There have been some efforts in states like Tennessee where the charter model has been introduced in those schools that have been chronically failing. Our sector is very much ready, willing, and able to go in those schools where parents are not making a choice to see if the charter model is in fact, that no excuses model is in fact effective at raising student achievement. So for us, it's not an either or, it's both. We have to do both of them in tandem. As far as online charter schools are concerned, we produced a report with NACSA and 50CAN 2 years ago in which we chronicled the chronic underachievement of online charter schools and called for regulations at the state level to address these issues. You don't want to completely get rid of them because for some students, these are the only choices available to them. But at the same time, they are very different from our brick and mortar schools, and their achievement certainly hasn't kept par with where we want to be as a community.
Great, thank you. Again, what we're talking about here is how do we get young people the opportunity to be what God created them to be. And of course, two things that I'd like to point out. One is that everything that I have learned about education is if you're not reading at the third grade level, by the time you finish the third grade, you're probably not going to graduate from high school. And if you don't graduate from high school, it's not, your future does not look very promising as far as seeking a job or being independent. The second thing is that, and I shouldn't globalize this, but the teachers that I talk to tell me the biggest problem is not the students, it's the parents. And so when I see schools that really do well, there is tremendous parental involvement in every level of that school. And my children attended private school, tremendous parental involvement, in public, inner city public school, tremendous political involvement. So the idea with the charter school is that is a group of, I guess, parents that have said, hey, we come together and we want something better for our children. So, Ms. Reese, you have mentioned some examples of public and charter schools working together. I've heard some examples like that as well. How do we get that young person through that third grade, reading at a third grade level?
Well, good reading programs make a difference, and a lot of our charter schools are thriving because they're putting programs that have been researched and tested, starting at an early age, making sure that they are making sure the students are actually proficient in reading before they move on to the next grade. So at the end of the day, our community is about raising student achievement. Dr. West highlighted some of the studies out there, but I want to just repeat some of the things he mentioned. According to Stanford's Credo, on average, an African-American, low-income charter school student gains an additional 59 days of learning in math and 44 additional days of learning in reading. So to us, that tells us there's something in the water in the charter school movement, especially for low-income students and minority students, that works. We should try to replicate those models.
Right. Dr. West, as far as parental involvement, how do we change that?
Well, we know that parental involvement is an important contributor to a successful school, and many charter schools do seek to encourage greater levels of parental involvement. Many of them have, they often call them parent contracts, that they sort of lay out the expectations for involvement. These are not legally enforceable in any way, but they set clear expectations for the ways parents will be involved. But I would actually say that many of the most successful charter schools in the movement, sure, they welcome parental involvement, but they don't actually build models that require it in order for students to be successful. They know that many of the families they serve face extreme disadvantage, and they want to ensure that students are, that they're able to serve students well regardless of what parents are able to contribute.
Okay, thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Dr. Adams, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ranking Member, for convening this hearing. And to the witnesses, thank you, Mr. Clark. Thank you so much for your service. Madam Chair, I just wanted to take a moment and introduce 3 interns that I have with me: Kristen Evans, law student from North Carolina Central; Erica Jordan from Wake Forest; and HBCU intern Tony Watlington from North Carolina A&T. I want to remark on how important today's conversation is for the future of our nation. So I'm happy that we have so many young people here today. The state of North Carolina just passed a bill that would allow the local small towns in Mecklenburg County that I represent to create their own independent charter schools, separating from the Charlotte-Mecklenburg public school system. Towns of Huntersville, Mint Hill, Matthews, and Cornelius in North Carolina say that their parents need options when considering their children's education. And I don't disagree with that, but part of having options is having the ability to choose. My fear in this proposal is that as Mecklenburg small towns create their own charters, children in the rest of the county will be resigned to attending increasingly segregated, increasingly under-resourced schools. So what choices will those parents living in inner-city Charlotte have? For those children who can attend these charters, what are we doing to ensure that quality controls are in place to guarantee that this choice isn't a false one? And Ms. Reese, this question is for you. But before you answer, your organization is committed to advancing the mission of charter schools, and another question would be, should low-performing charter schools be shut down?
There are a lot of questions in there. In terms of the specific question, in terms of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg issue, I'm not familiar exactly with the schools that are going to be created. As an organization, we firmly believe that schools should be inclusive settings. The vast majority of our leaders are creating these schools in order to take care of the needs of students who have traditionally been left behind. And I think in the case of North Carolina, we should keep an eye on how this is moving forward, and certainly the way authorizers are authorizing these schools, they can put parameters in place to make sure that the schools are in fact meeting the diverse needs of the community. To your second question, I believe that if a school is not performing well, it should be closed. Last year, we had roughly 200 public charter schools close. Over the past 5 years, over 1,000 charter schools have closed. In my opinion, the key difference between a charter school and a traditional school in many instances is that if it's not performing well, it's either not attracting enough families, or if the authorizer is not happy with the performance, that school can and should be closed.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I wanted to put in the record a report in the public interest which details some of the negative impacts of the rapid charter expansion in California, and the fact that these districts are facing a shortfall of over $140 million.
Without objection.
Thank you. So despite the many failures cited today, there are some charter schools that get it right. KIPP in Charlotte is an example of a school in my district that prioritizes the importance of growing critical resources to support low-income children of color through their education. But in general, charter schools show greater segregation by race, ethnicity, and income. So, Ms. Reese, in your quest to expand public charters, are you supportive of their tendency to purposefully segregate kids based on race and or income?
Well, absolutely not. We firmly believe that charter schools, and most of the leaders in the charter school movement, are in this business to serve the needs of students. And a lot of them are creating now schools that are diverse by design. Having said that, if our intent is to have more diversity in the charter schools space, there are some policies that need to be put in place. This committee, when it reauthorized the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, allowed for charter schools receiving charter schools program funding to do weighted lotteries, which is one mechanism to add more diversity to the school system.
Thank you. Let me move on to another question if I can. I just have a few seconds left. Mr. Clark, let me ask you, thank you for sharing the information about the Detroit system. These are the charter schools that they have their own boards. Were they regulated by the Detroit system, or can you speak to that just a moment?
They acted independently. They had their own board. So it wasn't like the people elected the board. They were appointed, okay? And the management company for the charter school that my daughter went to that I spoke of in my testimony, like I said, they're 350 miles away. So when we did have a concern, it's hard to get 100 parents 350 miles away to address an issue. And another thing, real quick, we felt locked out. They would have board meetings at 11 o'clock in the morning where parents are at work and teachers are at work as well. So it wasn't like they wanted us at the meetings.
Thank you very much. And Madam Chair, I'm going to yield back. I just hope that we are not in a position where we are infiltrating and really causing our public schools to go out of business. 90% of our kids are going to be educated there. I just wanted to put that in for the record. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Mr. Smucker, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for scheduling this discussion on a very important topic. I think charter schools are a very important component of our K through 12 system throughout the country. I served in the Pennsylvania State Legislature, served as education chair for some of that time, and had the opportunity to speak to many times to parents who participated in a lottery for their students. They really saw the quality of the education that their child received was really a lifeline to them for their future. And many times we're participating in lotteries, thousands of students participating when there were only a few slots available. And so I saw the joy that parents experience when they were selected. I think, in one way that the charters are really important is just providing that opportunity for students who would not have that opportunity otherwise for a great education. But it goes well beyond that, and I think it's important for us to remember that charter schools are public schools. They're publicly funded, and they can often be a way to innovate. There's sort of a laboratory that other schools then can learn from. And then third, and I may be in a minority in this view, or at least differ with others, I think charter schools are very important to improve the effectiveness of the entire landscape of schools, traditional public schools included. I come from a business background. I think providing parents choice and providing competition improves the quality of all the schools. And we have to realize, when you look at the entire landscape of about 2 million students in Pennsylvania, no matter how many private schools, charter schools that we had, still a large majority of students attended a traditional public school, 86% in Pennsylvania's case. And so anything that we do with charter schools has to also, we have to acknowledge that it should improve the quality of the entire education system. And I think charter schools could be effective in doing that by showing that it can be done. We should not accept poor schools, whether they be charter schools or whether they be a traditional public school. There should be accountability across the board. I've seen great charter schools. I've seen poor charter schools. I've seen absolutely great traditional public schools. I've seen poor public schools. And as policymakers, we should always expect that every student will have the opportunity for a quality education. One of the things that I've seen, Mr. Richmond, that I'll come to a question here eventually, is particularly in Pennsylvania, that's been my experience, charter schools are authorized by the school district. And I've been surprised that there's not more where school districts see a positive partnership with a charter school as very beneficial for the students of their district, and I've come to the conclusion that there are better ways to authorize public schools than potentially the sending school district. And I'd just like to get your thoughts on what you see as effective, what are the most effective ways to authorize public schools?
Thank you,
Or
Representative.
charter schools, I should say.
Yeah. Thank you. It's an important question. It's one we've touched on in some of our discussion already, like who's approving these schools, who's overseeing them. So it's a critical question that actually ties to the publicness of charter schools. To be a public school, a charter school is accountable in some fashion to the public. So 90% of the institutions that authorize charter schools in the country, 90% of them are school districts. Right? So that's not something you hear often. You're usually told just the opposite. These are all schools.
Is that the best way to authorize
Right,
them?
these are imposed against our will from far away. 90% of authorizers are school districts in this country. That doesn't automatically mean they're great or bad. Right. There are some school districts that are doing this work really well. There are some that are doing it pretty poorly. There are some entities that are not school districts that are authorizing charter schools that are doing it well or poorly. We've identified 3 qualities that we think are important for any institution that is authorizing charter schools. Number 1, there has to be a commitment that create good schools for kids and close those that fail, something you just referenced. That leadership has to be there, that vision. There has to be a commitment that this is important work for the institution to pay attention to. Can't be stuffed back in the corner somewhere. And the third thing is to use good professional judgment. This is not a compliance checklist activity. People have to be using good judgment. When we see those 3 qualities in existence, whether it's in a school district or a state ed department or some other authorizing body, when those 3 things are there, we tend to get good charter schools for kids.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Polis, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fox and Ranking Member Scott, for holding this hearing. Public charter schools have been an important source of innovation in public education. I'm a strong supporter of all public schools. In our state, we have charter schools, innovation schools, and district-run schools. I'm also honored to be a founding member of the Public Education Caucus here. I've gotten to know the ins and outs of public charter schools operationally before coming to Congress. I started 2 public charter school networks, and I was superintendent of New America School, a network of charter schools in Colorado and New Mexico that serves new immigrants and English language learners. And public charter schools can be a helpful component of our public education system. Obviously, accountability and equity are critical. With the extra flexibility that public charter schools have, we also need to make sure that they're fully held accountable. When we negotiated and wrote the Every Student Succeeds Act in 2015, updating the charter school program to improve accountability was a priority of mine. And I'm glad to say the new charter school program now includes additional transparency and accountability, requirements for community engagement, and also enters a discussion around the quality of charter authorizers, which was the part of the topic of the last question. Whether they are school districts, which they are in most cases, or whether they're other authorizers, the quality of the authorizer in writing the contract and enforcing the contract to ensure equity is absolutely critical. Finally, I want to point out that not all school choice is equal. Public charter schools and other magnet schools and others can be a meaningful option for many families under the right conditions, and of course they have to comply with federal law. But one of my concerns has been access through transportation to high-quality options for parents. And I think it's very important to make sure that we talk about making our choices in public education meaningful by including a discussion about how parents who might not have the luxury of being able to take their kid to a different school in a car are able to get their kid there. My first question is for Ms. Reese. When I hear from public charter schools in Colorado, the first issue that they bring up is a need for a solution to DACA, or deferred action. And they bring up DACA because they have students, families, teachers who are DACA eligible, dreamers that are living every day with the uncertainty that's been created by the Trump administration. Just as one example from Colorado, Brandon, who's a DACA student at a KIPP school in Colorado, said that he felt lucky to attend the public charter school that he did and is a big fan of his teachers, but he said, quote, fixing DACA is important for students because there's very few scholarships available to DACA students, which can be discouraging. Additionally, I always fear that I can be deported at any time, and fear that I will not be able to complete my degree, end quote. I'm glad to say he's a student at Colorado State University today, but other students don't have to go through that fear every day that they might be deported, or they rely on seemingly inefficient Congress for addressing their situation. I wanted to hear, Ms. Reese, have you spoken to students and families attending public charter schools who are worried and affected by Congress's inaction on immigration reform? And what do you think acting on DACA would do for the charter school community?
Well, first, Congressman, you are a big leader of the charter school movement, so thank you for your leadership, and we will miss you in this House after the November elections. Very quickly on DACA, our organization doesn't work on immigration issues, but we do have quite a few charter schools that are serving DACA students and also have teachers who have benefited from DACA. And we have said time and again that we stand firmly with them and will fight on their behalf in order to make sure that there is a viable solution to this issue. I believe Congress needs to deal with this issue next.
So, I mean, if Congress fails to act and if DACA expires, there will be public charter schools that lose teachers that are good teachers today?
Yes, if under the current circumstances, and we haven't done a survey of how many students in charter schools are under DACA and how many of our teachers are under DACA, but a fair number of our schools in Texas and California, Denver, are serving these students right now, and these students have grown with the schools, so the stories that they have are quite heart-wrenching. They were on the Hill in this past November visiting with members of Congress, and their stories were extremely compelling.
The second model I wanted to explore in your last 30 seconds are early college public charter schools. We have several in Colorado. Students can take dual and concurrent enrollment and even earn an associate's degree with their high school degree. I wanted to ask about that example of innovation, but also what charter schools are doing to help spread innovation across other public schools, one of their original goals.
So again, that was one of the original tenets of charter schools, in addition to offering choices and giving teachers more autonomy to run their schools. When it comes to innovation, though, you need two people to partner with one another to share that innovation. And I worry at times that we, even though we're ready, willing, and able to share our innovations, there's no real mechanism to transfer that innovation to the larger district system. Denver is an exception. There has been dialogue between the city and the charter school movement for quite some time, and I believe, as I said earlier, that it would be very instrumental for more school district leaders to visit the Denvers of the world to see how that how the innovation is being transferred and how these discussions are taking place. But some of the key innovations that have transferred, for instance, are expanding the school day and expanding the school year. One of the key reasons our schools do so well in low-income communities is for that reason. Another innovation, of course, is the way we train our teachers and we compensate them to make sure that we're attracting the best and the brightest, that we're keeping them in the classroom, that we're offering them greater pay. So there are a variety of innovations, but charter schools are not a monolith. So if you've been to one school, you've just been to that one school. And so there's room to do a lot more, and I think it's imperative on our movement to really step it up and do a lot more innovation in our space.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Garrett, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In a town literally bursting at the seams with hyperbole and rhetorical bunk, I want to be really clear that what I'm about to say is my heartfelt feeling, and that is that in my 16 months here, I've gotten to know the ranking member of this committee quite well and could not hold him in higher regard as a human being. He's as fine a man as I know here. With that said, I want to speak to the repeated suggestion that charter schools lead to segregation by way of working towards a question. Ms. Reese's stated goal for charter schools was, quote, high-quality public education. I look at a legal analysis and the heartbreaking tragedy that was Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which institutionalized the idea that segregation was somehow okay. And I've spoken at some length with the ranking member, and we share a passion for a 16-year-old girl in Farmville, Virginia in 1951 named Barbara Johns, who led a student walkout that became the only student-initiated case amalgamated into Brown versus Board of Education, wherein it was a start towards dismantling the ridiculous legal lie of Plessy versus Ferguson. That was finalized in 1964 with the passage of the Civil Rights Act and subsequent legislation. And as it relates to the sort of partisan barbs here, I would remind folks that 39% of Democrats in the House opposed the Civil Rights Act, while 20% of Republicans. In the Senate, 27% of Democrats opposed the Civil Rights Act, while 6% of Democrats. And there was actually a filibuster of the Civil Rights Act by one Robert Byrd, who, a presidential candidate, later called her mentor and a great leader and gave a kiss on the cheek with knowledge of the fact that he had formerly been a member of the Ku Klux Klan. So, segregation is illegal, has been since 1964, and if you'd like to give partisan credit, you can do that based on the mathematical facts that I outlined. And so to use the term which absolutely and rightly stirs emotion, segregation, I think is hyperbolic at best and a little bit disingenuous at worst, because segregation is not the law of the land. So if indeed there is increased segregation, it is then de facto segregation, which relies in its essence on two facts. Number one, that individuals in the United States of America have the ability to choose, wherein their socioeconomic status creates this wherewithal, where they live. And number two, that geographical compactness creates circumstances wherein we cut down costs, which is a driving factor in public education, by virtue of a reduction in transportation and service expenses, right? These are realities that we know. So to say charter schools boost segregation, I think, is not a really fair argument. Again, with the greatest respect for the individual, and I mean that sincerely. But I'll tell you, there's been a fight over charter schools that long predates my entry into this august body and will continue after my nearing departure, and that manifests itself largely in state legislatures. And I can give examples. For example, when I was in the Virginia State House, there was a fight to allow students, and I believe it was 6 failing school districts in the entire state, the ability to attend school in adjacent school districts, which was opposed along party lines and vetoed by a governor named McAuliffe for reasons like that stated by my now colleague in Congress, former State Senator Don McEachin, who said, well, I don't like the idea that there's a lottery, to which I responded, at least in a lottery, somebody wins. And I'm reminded of the circumstance that I read in the paper with great jubilance and joy of Darren Francois, I believe I'm pronouncing that right, in New Orleans, Louisiana, at the International High School, wherein Mr. Francois attended a charter school and was recently in the paper for having received admission to 83 colleges. African American and raised by a single mom, Mr. Francois broke any number of expectations against him to become a high achiever, empowered by virtue of education. You see, there's a debate that goes on and on about nature versus nurture, and I will tell you to a metaphysical certainty, I believe in nurture. That if you take a young person, regardless of their background, regardless of the color of their skin, regardless of who they love, regardless of how they worship, and you place them in the right circumstances, they will be able to succeed. That's America. That's the promise that is America. Now, it manifests itself in reality with socioeconomic disparities, et cetera, but I would argue that this de facto segregation is largely a result of socioeconomic circumstances and not of children who are failing public schools, but of public schools who are failing our children. And so I would argue that while charter schools are no panacea, as panaceas do not exist in any entity or region governed by fallible human beings, that there are outcome disparities that show that where all other things are equal, opportunity is increased and outcomes are better. Ms. Reese, would you concur with the bulk of my sentiment?
Since we're out of time, I believe so for the most part, yes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Garrett. Ms. Davis, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the discussion today, and I'm sorry I missed a good part of it, but I wanted to talk just a moment. I represent San Diego. We have some great charter schools there. They function as testing sites, largely with high accountability standards, and I think there's a sentiment and an interest, of course, in that being part of their mission. Their basic mission, of course, like with all actually schools, public schools particularly, is to make sure that every young person who resides in that school has an equal chance to be successful. And I think that's something that we all want. We know that we can't guarantee outcomes, but we want to make sure that they have an equal opportunity to be successful. One of the concerns, I think, beyond the lessons there and in other communities is what we can do to ensure better results. And I want to ask you, and I'll start with Mr. Clark, about what do you think the federal role is in ensuring that accountability? I know one of my colleagues asked the question about authorizing charter schools, what's the oversight role of the federal government and even the state government for that matter, as well as local entities. But what do you think we could be doing better as we look to future legislation to speak to that federal role and also the state roles in accountability?
Okay, thank you. My answer to the question about accountability is it needs to come at the lowest level. We have a saying back in Detroit at 482 Forward, nothing about us without us, which means if there's a problem, those that are directly affected by the problem need to be at the table to address the problem, not a governing body 350 miles away. Nothing against the people in Lansing or you guys in DC, but it's our children that are being traumatized day in and day out, battling with the educational system that they have to navigate through back in Detroit. So a local governing body of parents and residents whose children are in this fight needs to be at the table to hold the educators, the authorizers, accountable to what they said they're going to do.
And isn't that, in many ways, the reason that charter schools have grown up? Because people needed to have that. I think what I'm looking for, and again, it's an open question about what is our role here? And how is it that the tone, the guardrails, if you will, what is it that you think might be missing in our ability to send that message very strongly to schools? And anybody else who wants to jump in?
I'll offer a few thoughts. Thank you for your question. I want to touch on the fact that we really are identifying some important issues here today. And again, just to restate my appreciation that the conversation is happening. Concerns about segregation are tremendously important, around parents having information they need to make good decisions for their kids, about the ability to even send your child, transportation availability. These are critical parts of success. The federal charter school program does provide some funds to allow communities to develop those kinds of solutions. So we're seeing that in places like Indiana, Rhode Island, and others. I mentioned earlier the importance of the predominance of school districts are the major type of authorizer in this country. And that's a valuable role. Unfortunately, in Detroit this spring, the school district decided to get out of the action of overseeing charter schools. They ceded that work to those other folks. We think that was unfortunate, that there can be a role for school districts. Now, the mayor seems to be stepping in Detroit, and he's put together a commission to try to tackle some of these problems. But that local presence is important. And having people working together to solve the problems around information, enrollment systems,
right,
transportation, that's what we need to do to have this work for all kids.
Anybody else? I know, Mr. Clark, if you wanted to respond as well, that I understand what you're saying. I think it's critically important, and especially where we see children that have been traumatized by the need to move around even in schools and what that does to parents and to children.
I can agree that there has been some movement as far as more local accountability, but not as much as I would like to see. Far too much wrong has been done to these kids and these parents in this fight for equitable education.
Yeah.
We cannot stop. We must continue to fight.
Thank you very much. I think my time is up. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Davis. Mr. Wahlberg, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. And Mr. Clark, I did several years ago have an opportunity to visit probably your charter school that you're talking about and the great concerns, and we saw problems there. I had an opportunity to visit another higher performing charter school in Detroit also that was offering an alternative in a very difficult area, but offering with some good success. And I think leadership matters, and we are hopeful that the Mayor of Detroit, who has been working with the governor of the state as well, and community activists who have gotten more involved in a city, and more importantly, in an educational system that ought to be a quality system in a city as major as Detroit was. It was the Silicon Valley of the United States, really, years ago, in manufacturing, in engineering, and everything that went on. So it's tragic to see some of the things that have happened. But I've also had the privilege of visiting a large number of charter schools around the state of Michigan, including in my district most recently, having the opportunity to visit Island City Academy, which is a wonderful school located in Eaton Rapids, Michigan. This academy is kindergarten through 8th grade, and currently the school is ranked in the 81st percentile of Michigan's top to bottom ranking. Not 100th, but it's up there, and working with a diverse student body as well in that charter school. Dr. West, what effect does the heightened student achievement demonstrated by many charter schools have on the local community?
Thank you for the question. So what effect it has on the local community is not something that we've been able to study in great detail so far because the charter movement for the most part is so new. So we know a lot about how charter schools affect students' achievement and their likelihood of completing high school, for example. We're beginning to learn about how the experience of attending a high-quality charter school or a charter school in general affects college long-term outcomes like college attainment and earnings, and the emerging evidence there is very encouraging, I would say. In terms of broader community impacts, I don't know that we have much in the way of rigorous evidence on that point as of yet. I will say, though, that we know that school quality is a key driver of housing prices, of the desirability of a neighborhood. People like attending schools in their local community, and so everything that we would know from what we know about education writ large would suggest that that could be a transformative impact for a community.
Yeah, I would think so. And the charter school movement has been around a while, and we're hoping that those studies come out because, frankly, we know that with a public school, if it's a good public school, a great public school, people will make life decision choices to make sure they're there in that school district. Let me ask a follow-up. You had, in answering another question about the parental involvement in charters and the success there, indicated that, and I think rightfully so, that in certain cases in charters, you can't rely on the parental involvement because they're not there. So you have to do the best with what you have. But what are some of the other factors when you look at success for a charter school that you find are key?
I think it really comes down to teachers more than anything else. And all of education research suggests that the quality of the teacher is the most important school-based influence on students' academic success. And what's unique about charters is that they have much more flexibility in how they make decisions about who teaches there and who does not. And so I actually think that's one of the key innovations in the charter model, less than anything, more so than anything sort of discrete they do pedagogically that might transfer to a traditional district, is just the ability that leaders have to take advantage of that flexibility to assemble a team of like-minded educators who are bought into the school's philosophy.
What would encourage a teacher, a great teacher, to choose a charter school over a traditional public school?
I would think it would be the ability to teach with others who are bought into the same common educational philosophy. We know that leadership quality is a key influence on whether teachers want to stay in a given school, so I think it would be the opportunity to work with a strong leader. But in terms of what's most distinctive about a charter, I think it's, again, the ability of a leader and a group of teachers to establish a common educational vision and sort of work towards that together.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Scott, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, when we talk about charter schools, we talk about students being trapped in low-performing schools. And rather than give a select few a different choice, our response really ought to be to improve those low-performing schools. I think it's noteworthy that you don't have a clamor for charter schools in areas where the schools are well-funded. In fact, studies have shown that charter schools, on average, are actually worse than average. Some are better, but more often worse. We've also found that rigorous oversight makes a difference. Madam Chair, in response to my distinguished colleague from Virginia, I look forward to working with him to fulfill the vision of Barbara Johns, who led the walkout in protest of unequal educational opportunities. But without assigning fault or blame, the fact is that increased choice has led to increased segregation. We can address this reality, but we first have to acknowledge what the GAO told us 2 years ago, that segregation in schools is increasing, particularly in charter schools. Mr. Clark, I want to thank you again for your service, and thank you for being with us this morning. We found that the overwhelming majority of charter schools in Detroit are operated by for-profit companies. In your view, are the for-profit charters in Detroit maximizing profit at a cost to students and parents?
Can you repeat that question, sir?
Are the schools looking out for profits, or are they more interested? Is the fact that they're looking out for profits detrimental to the students?
I do believe, in my experience, that profits are the number one motivation. And I say that because my daughters, matter of fact, all three of them, have come home without textbooks that they need. So there are a lot of resources that they should receive at their charter schools that they don't.
Thank you.
The administrations at the school, during conversations and meetings with them, it was never a conversation about, they never made me feel like my children's education was priority. It was always another way of cutting a corner, as with the classes. They promised 2 hours of math and reading, math and English. They knock it down to 45 minutes. They fired the right teachers. Take that back. They fired the wrong teachers. Like my daughter, one day the CEO of the school saw my daughter in the hallway and she said, "What's wrong?" And she says, "My heart is broken." She said, "Why?" She said, "Because you just fired my favorite teacher." There's no reason to fire your best teachers. There's no reason. My daughter's motivation dropped from that point on, and she felt that she was not, at that point, she felt that that school did not make her a priority. The things that you promise kids, you should keep your word. The college seminar class, my daughters look forward to that. When you cut that, for whatever reason you come up with in your head, that's wrong. That's detrimental to all of these kids. They expect to go to school and learn and then be prepared for college, which is the next phase.
Thank you. And I want to try to get at another question if I can. Thank you very much for that answer. This can be really a simple yes or no. I want to ask all of the panelists. Washington State subjects all public schools to its open record law. In Washington, D.C., public charter schools are not subject to open records laws. Should any public charter school be subject to the same open records law as a non-charter school? Ms. Reese?
Can I ask a question? By open records laws, do you mean public forums to come to the school board meeting, or
No,
in many
well,
states there are
freedom of information. Freedom of information laws. Mr. Richmond?
We haven't, I need to think about the question to see how current state statutes treat this particular question.
Well, some do and some don't. The question is whether all public schools receiving public monies should be subject to open records laws like freedom of information. Does anybody want to answer?
I feel that everybody should be held to the same standard.
Good.
If public school gets public dollars and charter schools get public dollars, it should be a level playing field.
Dr. West?
So transparency in the governance of charter schools is very important. The reason I hesitate to offer an absolute yes is because it's not an issue that I've looked at closely. I know that sometimes there are unintended consequences. For example, open meeting laws have in some cases made it impossible for charter school boards that are not comprised in a single geographic area to comply with, and exceptions have needed to be carved out. And so I just would not want to offer an absolute yes without doing more study on the topic.
Mr. Richmond?
Yes, with the recognition that even within that statement, within the states, there are considerable debates going on right now about how that law does apply.
Okay, Ms. Reese, did you want to answer?
Again, I think we need to take a close look at the consequences of these additional rules and regulations on charter schools. But by and large, my reaction is yes, they should be able to make this information available. Our model law encourages states to have open meeting laws in place for charter school boards to conduct their meetings in public, for instance.
Mr. Scott, your time has expired.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Grossman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Sure. We'll give maybe Dr. West a question, if maybe someone else wants to weigh in as well. It seems to me, when I tour schools or hear anecdotes about good and bad schools, sometimes the difference is the ability to which you get the most out of your employees, and if you have an employee who's not cutting it, you let them go. And it seems to me when I deal with districts that aren't that good, you have kind of a superintendent who's a glad-hander, never moves out the dead weight. In general, not in general, even in specific, Dr. West, which type of schools find it easier to move on the dead weight? Mr. Clark talked about, for whatever reason, I assume he's got his reason, he knew a charter school that wanted to get rid of their best teachers. I've never heard of that. But I think the real problem is when you have really underperforming people, maybe don't care, burned out, which type of school gets rid of that teacher quicker? Seems to care more about the students or just go with the flow?
It's an important topic in that we know that one of the most important ways in which a school leader, a principal, matters for a school's success is how they manage their teachers, and in particular, how they make decisions about who stays and who goes. I would simply say that it's very clear that in most states, charter schools have a great deal more flexibility in making those decisions. So to some degree, that means principals can both do a better job or a worse job. And I think we know from the average results that they tend to do a better job, but it's clear that they have more flexibility.
Okay, so you're saying that there's an underperforming teacher, they'll generally be more caring, or maybe it's just the rules they work under as far as removing. I'll give you an anecdote, and you can, maybe we'll ask Ms. Reese, Mr. Richmond, Mr. Clark to say. Back home, I talked to a guy who sent his children to public school. He had 2 kids. The oldest kid got to 2nd grade, and all the parents were worried that he'd get this bad teacher who everybody knew was bad. Fortunately, his first kid dodged a bullet and wasn't wasting 2nd grade. 9 years later, his second child got there, and to his shock and dismay, the same teacher was still there, and the parents were still hoping that their kids didn't get the bad teacher. Whether it was because the administration in that public school didn't care about the kids that much, or whether it was just plain too tough given the contract. And you only go through 2nd grade once. If you get a bad 2nd grade teacher, you don't get another chance. You miss 2nd grade. Which type of arrangement would be more likely to put the kids first and remove that bad teacher, and which type would be more likely to have the bad teacher there for 10 years screwing up 10 years' worth of second graders' education. Ms. Reese, I can see you want to say something.
Well, of course, we have great freedoms and flexibilities in the charter school sector in order to attract the best and the brightest, to offer them the support that they need to thrive in the classroom. Some of our most effective charter school organizations place a premium on just that, attracting the best, offering them the support, grooming them, and elevating them up to a school leader eventually. So my answer will be obvious in that I think the charter school sector has done a much better job of attracting and keeping these high-quality teachers. If you walk, for instance, to BASIS, which is a high-performing network in Arizona, they place a premium on attracting teachers with subject matter mastery, often college professors, into the classroom to teach students.
Okay, can I just jump in very quickly on that point?
You're not answering the question. I want you to answer the question.
Well, I think to elaborate, I think, on what Nina is saying, in a charter school, the fact that the parents have the ability to seek out an alternative if they are assigned to the second grade teacher that people want to avoid, that puts stronger pressure on the leaders of that school to deal with the underperformance.
In other words, if there was a charter school, my friend in that district, which there wasn't, my friend would have had the option, if they didn't move along the underperforming teacher, of going to a charter school instead.
Or vice versa, if the underperforming teacher was in the charter school, that charter school would have a great deal of flexibility and incentive to address the problem. And if we look at survey data, we find that parents of charter school students, nationally representative sample, compare them to district school parents, are much more satisfied with the quality of their child's school, and in particular with the quality of teaching.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. DeSagne, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate this hearing, and I must admit this conversation is vexing to me. So much of education is subjective. I'm sure there's lots of research as our own prejudices that we bring. All of us have strong feelings about our own education and the education that our kids get. It's just part of us genetically, but this sort of presented to us, and I'll just say I'm thinking about this because I'm from California, and in our primary election there were millions of dollars spent in races, from the governor's race down to school board races, and everything in between, basically choosing sides. When I first started in the legislature, I believe charters have some worth, but I also am concerned about a lot of the questions that Mr. Scott brought up about who's left behind, and I'm also mindful about how charter schools began after Brown versus the Board of Education, and I'm a believer in what George Santayana said, a Harvard professor. Those who forget history are condemned to repeat it. So how do we reconcile this? I mean, if we really focused, and I'll start with you, Dr. West, if you're really focused objectively, open-mindedly, we need to have available to every young person in this country a robust public education system. So how do we really get to evaluate that in the most objective process, looking at things at charters that work, and how do we bring them to scale? And then accountability, and Mr. Richmond, I'd love to hear your comments, and Mr. Clark, we had the secretary sit here last week, and questions I asked based on editorial opinions of the Detroit newspaper about how it didn't work and the lack of accountability in Detroit. So I wish we didn't have to make these sort of, we're in one camp or the other, that at least it appears what's happening in California politics right now. Dr. West, you're a researcher. You definitely have strong opinions, but I assume that you believe one of my favorite quotes from Goethe is, doubt grows with knowledge. I'm sure you have moments where you second guess your own research.
Yeah, so thank you for a really rich question. I think, as I think about first, I share your sort of premise, which is that we need to make sure that we have a system that provides access to high-quality public education for all students. And the question is, where do charters fit into that mix? And I think they are one means by which we can do a better job of reaching that goal. And that they, in particular, have a presence or a role to play in places where the existing arrangements have clearly fallen short of that goal and continue to do so for an extended period of time. I think the question becomes, what role do they play in the long run? And frankly, that depends on the extent to which the traditional system responds to the presence of charters and other forms of competition in order to improve and make sort of additional non-traditional actors no longer necessary. But I think there's been a theme in this conversation that to some extent we have to choose between promoting options like charter schools and reforming existing institutions. And I'd like to emphasize that I see them as more complementary, those two approaches, rather than in conflict with one another. My question of doubt is about what the end game is. How does it play out in the long run?
For the kids and for the country. So I have a very diverse district. I was in one school district not 15 miles away from another one recently, and a third of this district, because it's a very affluent part of the Bay Area, gets their funding from Parents Foundation. Went to another one in a poor part of the district, less than 15 minutes away. Community middle school really does a great job, and the principal said, we need more money for behavioral health for our teachers because they have to do so much for these kids. So maybe to Mr. Richmond and then Mr. Clark, it strikes me that what happened in Detroit is exactly opposite if I'm a proponent of charter schools, because of you don't have the rich accountability, or at least that's the criticism. Maybe Mr. Richmond briefly and Mr. Clark on accountability.
Sure. I want to just touch on almost every issue that is brought up here today on accountability, discrimination, financial transparency, goes back to how are these schools being approved in the first place and how are they being overseen? Almost every one of them. So as you wrestle with these questions about why is this happening, what can we do differently, it goes back to those authorizing bodies.
If I can just let Mr. Clark finish, because I've only got 10 seconds. Sorry about that.
What was the question again, sir?
My time's up. It was mostly around accountability in Detroit, but that's a deeper question. Be happy to talk to you afterwards. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. DeSaulnier. Mr. Thompson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks to the panel for being here today. I'm privileged to represent the 5th, soon to be the 15th Congressional District of Pennsylvania. The district that I so proudly represent is one of the most rural districts in the country. While the new district map will have a landmass roughly the size of New Jersey, within that district we only have one charter school. This is not because Pennsylvania lacks charter schools. In fact, Pennsylvania has 183 charter schools that serve 133,753 students, with nearly half of those students being served in the Philadelphia School District. The criticism surrounding charter schools often deals with the lack of diversity and inclusiveness of difficult-to-serve and disabled students with disabilities. However, only 10% of charter school funding is distributed to rural communities, leaving another large demographic of students without the benefits that charter schools have to offer. Mrs. Reese and Mr. Richmond, how do we get more charter schools in rural communities, and how do we ensure that more of those charter schools are high-performing?
It's a great question. Only about 11% of charter schools are currently in rural communities. There are some great examples in states like North Carolina. KIPP has a great rural charter school right up the state line. In Delaware, there's a great rural charter school called Sussex Academy. I think the first step is to have a conversation with the leaders of these schools and those individuals in these rural communities to get them familiar with the concept of chartering. For a very long time, most of our concentration has been in inner city settings where the demand is high and there is a density of student population. Unfortunately, we haven't been paying as much attention to rural communities, and I think it's time to change that conversation and start to introduce the concept in more communities. In some instances, it could be very conceivably easy for a school district leader to convert some of its own schools to charter schools. So the way we would go about doing this in rural communities is going to differ from community to community, but it's going to start with introducing folks on the ground to those who are currently operating effective rural charter schools. In a lot of cases, it's been a conversation first, followed by quite frankly, a local business or a community leader coming together to help that individual start a charter school.
Mr. Richmond, any thoughts you on those?
Just one additional one, after saying that this has been a tough challenge to solve in the charter community. In many states, when a charter school is approved by a school district, it can only serve kids from that school district. So if there's a small number, if it's a small town, you're going to have a hard time economically figuring out, well, how do we get another school? If you can broaden that geography to a larger area, serve surrounding counties, then you're more likely to be able to get the numbers to work.
90%, as you had mentioned, 90% of charter schools are authorized by public schools. With that comes a level of responsibility by the traditional public schools for the educational experience and for the outcomes that are delivered in these charter schools. What access to information does the authorizing public schools have on regarding the charter school performance? Do the authorizing schools have access to what they need to be able to assure that oversight and accountability for what they ultimately have authorized?
One of the positive features of a school district authorizing charter schools is that it can have that information. So I did this work for 10 years in the school system in Chicago. We knew who every one of the students were in the charter schools, their student ID numbers, their free and reduced lunch status, their special education status. They were part of our overall system. We had that information. In some states, that's not true. I know in Michigan, authorizers, because they're universities usually, they have trouble even getting some of that information because of privacy laws. So this is getting into a technical, kind of wonky area, but that information is important for the policymakers, for the authorizers, and for the public. So the more we can make that information available and transparent to the public and to parents, the better we'll be.
I would agree. I've heard, and I support all forms of education. I just want high access to good quality education. But I've heard complaints from our traditional public schools that they're held accountable for the charter schools they've authorized. And this is in Pennsylvania, probably maybe different from elsewhere, but they find themselves in difficult situations because they don't have the information to really.
I was in their shoes, and I'll say they ought to be held accountable for those charter schools. If you approved them and are overseeing them, then you are accountable for them. So I've been there, and that's the reality. We all have to be accountable for good outcomes for kids.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I'm going to ask my questions, and then we will wind up. For Ms. Reese, Mr. Richmond, Dr. West, a question that I hope won't take up the whole time, so I'd ask you to be fairly succinct. How has the continued support and expansion of charter schools positively impacted academic achievement of all students, including those who may struggle due to language disability or socioeconomic status or combination? What additional gains can be accomplished to further support access to high-quality charter school growth? We've heard some numbers on the other side, so I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
So very quickly, the evidence, based on all the randomized field trials and the quasi-experimental studies done on charter schools, is unequivocally in favor of making sure that charter schools expand, especially in low-income communities and in communities where a large percentage of low-income and minority students reside. So again, going back to the Credo at Stanford report, 36 days of additional learning in math for African American students, 26 days of additional learning in reading for African American students. For Hispanic students, it's 48% of additional learning in math and 25 additional months for reading. So by and large, we think that the evidence is in our favor and that we should double down on these investments. Where a charter school is not performing well, though, we should close them immediately.
Mr. Richmond.
Regarding that portion of your question about access, there's a lot that we can do, and some cities are really leading the way on this. We need to make sure it's not enough just to open a new school. We have to help parents get information about it, good, reliable information about it. The enrollment and admissions processes into those schools have to be run fairly, non-discriminatorily. Transportation, we heard mention of that. Transportation is a big issue. So we have to be willing to tackle that and find ways to solve it. So opening the school is great, but providing that access to kids that didn't have access to a good school, that's what we're about. And we can do that if we work together.
Thank you. Dr. West.
Very briefly, on the portion of the question that asked about how best to support access to high-quality charter school growth, I think I mentioned in my testimony the fact that we do have some evidence now that there's a lot of variation in the quality of individual charter schools. We've heard that a lot today, that there's some evidence that the charter sector is improving over time as a result of the closure of low-performing schools, the expansion of high-quality charter schools, and I think we need to think about how to speed up that process. That's the way to expand access to high-quality schools. So that means authorizer accountability that Mr. Richmond has been talking about, and it also means continuing support of the replication and expansion grant program that was included for the first time as statute in ESSA. I don't see the federal government allocating its funds to the schools that have been most successful as going around states in any way. Those schools still need to be approved and have charters authorized by their own states, but it's a way to, again, speed this process of continuous improvement.
Thank you. Ms. Reese, have we seen any potential for charter schools to transform career and technical education?
So we have roughly 400 charter schools that label themselves as schools that are serving CTE or STEM fields, and that's roughly 200,000 students are in these charter schools. As you know, charter schools are schools of choice. So we, depending on the needs of the community, in some communities they have grown, in other communities they haven't. But there are definitely some best practices coming out of some of these schools. I was visiting the Purdue University Charter School in Indianapolis recently. This is a university that decided to create a charter school in Indianapolis in order to attract more students from that city to its school rather than what it was getting initially, which was students from all over the world. And so it will be interesting to see how many more low-income and minority students end up getting their degree from Purdue University thanks to this charter school.
Well, thank you very much. I will yield back my time, and I would yield to the gentlewoman from California for any closing comments she'd like to make.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I appreciate your last question, because as we look to partner with communities and schools in CTE as well, we want to be sure that many opportunities open up for young people, and I think we're really primed to do that and to scale that in a way that makes a lot of sense and creates some careers that young people perhaps hadn't even envisioned in the past. I wanted to just comment because I think we know that the key for all young people is a good future, and we have to be sure that all schools, so we have 90% of students attend schools that are not charters or are not specially designed by communities, but in fact are all still part of communities and need to function very well. So it's all about leadership, it's about resources, and it's about how we make sure that communities are mobilized to do better by their kids. And that's something that I think is a general theme that we see throughout schools. We just have to be sure that more communities feel a need to do that, and we have to look to how kids are achieving, and if we find that, as we know, that there are pockets of students who are not, then we have to make sure that that school system is equalized for more of those children. Innovation, of course, becomes key, but school choice, as we know, is not enough if the opportunities for those youngsters falls far short when we compare the investment of those communities for those schools. And it's a big charge, but we all need to be engaged and involved and focused on that. So I thank you all very much for being here, and thank the chairwoman.
Thank you, Ms. Davis. Again, I want to thank our witnesses for being here today and for sharing your valuable time with us. We've heard a lot about what makes the charter sector a valuable part of the educational landscape for our students. We've also heard some very real concerns that can occur when there's lax oversight of the schools. Much of this conversation, I think, boils down to accountability. Congress, through the Every Student Succeeds Act, requires states to hold all public schools, both traditional and charter, accountable for delivering a high-quality education. We've spoken on this issue, and now states and school districts are working to ensure the promise of ESSA is delivered to the students they serve. With charter schools today, we learned today it's critical for authorizers to also do their part because, as Mr. Clark said, his kids get only one chance. And I agree with him that the accountability needs to be at the closest level to the students. I served on a local school board for 12 years, and I believe very much in that accountability. I've also been thinking about the question of why we don't have more schools and more charter schools in rural areas. And obviously, it's a matter of scale sometimes, number of students. But I also think about the fact that I represent a very rural area, and I'm out in my district every weekend talking to people, meeting with people. And I really have a feeling that because of rural areas, people are much more involved in their schools, and that perhaps the schools are much more responsive to the parents and the teachers, and the people who are in the schools live in the community. The difference, I think, between the rural schools and the urban schools is that you don't quite have the same sense of community that you have in the rural areas. And I wonder, that's not something that I know, Dr. West, that anybody's doing any research on, but it would be fascinating to know whether something like that is occurring. But, you know, honestly, rural people just step up to meet the needs in their communities in a way that's quite different from what happens in urban areas. There was a cake auction put on by a little church recently in one of my counties, and I went by last year accidentally. This year I plan to go. About 25 families there, or 25 people there, about 12 or 13 families. Every one of them brought one or two cakes. They raised $4,000 at that cake auction. They bought their own cakes. There were like maybe 5 other people who showed up who didn't bring a cake. And all that money went to the backpack program. They donated all that money to buy food for students on weekends. And I'm just, you know, constantly amazed at the generosity and the involvement of rural people in the needs of the community. And I just don't think you see that as you do in urban areas. I think we've learned today that something I didn't actually know, and I appreciate your bringing it out, 90% of the charter schools are authorized by the school districts. That is new information for me. Obviously, I think that is something for us to pay attention to, because a lot of people, I think there are a lot of people who are opposed to charter schools generally, and I think somehow or another associate nefarious reasons for charter schools. But if the school districts themselves are authorizing the schools, it must tell us something about a need that is out there that even the school districts see and want to see happen. You talked about the issue of the quality of teachers, and I appreciated very much the comments made about the charter schools having that ability to employ the best teachers and to let go the teachers that don't fit in, that they have a common philosophy, and that in all cases that I think charter schools are very successful, there are strong leaders. And I think, Dr. West, you said they establish a common vision. I wish that were possible again in all the public schools. But we've known, again, for a long, long time, that what makes a great school, what makes it successful, is a wonderful leader who hires excellent teachers and parental involvement. We've known that. And that's what generally charter schools do, and what often traditional public schools are not able to do, or do not. They either don't welcome the parental involvement, or the parents think, this is not my responsibility, I'm just turning it over to the schools to do. For whatever reason, you don't always get the same involvement. But when you do, you get great results. I'm, again, a big believer in charter schools. I've told people this, you all haven't heard it, my colleagues have heard it, the staff have heard it. I grew up in a very poor area, got an excellent education, and worked hard. It helped me get out of poverty and to have a successful life. What I'd like to see is that for everybody. I think you can do it in the traditional public schools, but I think you can do it easier in the charter schools. And as I said, we've heard how critical it is for parents to be involved and the schools to work with families so the students succeed. I do believe the charter schools do a better job of that, and I wish that more of that were done in the public schools. So I thank you for calling our attention to many issues that need to be resolved, but also reminding people that we have to hold accountable all along the chain those who are responsible for different things. So thank you very much for being here. There being no further business, this hearing is adjourned.